Well, folks, welcome to Chapter 6, Osseous Tissue. So this is broken up into, I don't know, 3 or 4 mini lectures. Maybe it's 4 or 5 mini lectures. So let's get started. First of all is just the introduction to the skeletal system. So we're talking about the bones of the skeleton, and that's probably obvious to you. But in addition, we have to talk about uh, the cartilage, the cartilages, ligaments, and connective tissues also associated with the bones. For example, what connective tissue is associated with the bone? Well, there's a periosteum around these bones, and that periosteum is dense, irregular connective tissue. Well, then you might say, well, that's easy. That's one. Well, when your bones are formed embryonically, they're actually a cartilage framework for most of them. You're going to learn 2 different ways to form bones. You're going to learn an endochondral and an intramembranous way to form bones. Well, the endochondral mechanism starts with cartilage. So you're going to have a hyaline cartilage framework, and it actually is the shape of the bone, but it's not bone yet. It's cartilage, and the cartilage is surrounded by a perichondrium. And by the way, cartilage itself is a connective tissue, as you know now. And that perichondrium is dense, irregular connective tissue. So that'll be a hyaline cartilage surrounded by a dense, irregular connective tissue. So that's the precursors to bones, the 2 connective tissues involved. The mature bone, the 2 connective tissues involved. Bone is a connective tissue, and the periosteum is a different type of connective tissue. And then we have other connective tissues connecting bones to bones. And ligaments connect bones to bones, and that's dense, regular connective tissue. So bone is connective tissue. Cartilage is connective tissue. Perichondrium is dense, irregular connective tissue. Periosteum is dense, irregular connective tissue. And then the ligaments connecting bones to bones are dense, regular connective tissues. So we got a lot of connective tissues we're going to talk about, and when you finish connective tissue a few chapters ago, before the skin chapter, you probably realized it was one of the harder of the 4 tissue types to study because it was very diverse. Well, here are the 5 primary functions of the skeleton. Probably support is probably pretty obvious to you. Storage of minerals, however. So bone is a storage place for excess calcium. When you have excess calcium in your blood, you throw it into the bones. It stores magnesium. It stores other minerals, by the way. Even toxic minerals can be stored in your bones, and that can lead to some problems. The medullary cavity of bones. Now I'm calling it the medullary cavity because when you say bone marrow, that means something different. That's the soft tissue within the cavity. So the medullary cavity of the bones contain hematopoietic marrow. Hematopoietic marrow. That means blood cell producing tissue. But as you get older, a lot of that bone marrow changes from hematopoietic bone marrow to yellow marrow, and that's just lipids, which, by the way, is a connective tissue. It's a loose connective tissue, what we call adipose. So storage of minerals and lipids is a function of bones because the medullary cavity can store lipids. Blood cell production, major function of bones. All blood cells are produced in the bone marrow, and it's called red marrow because if it's converted to yellow marrow, it's not producing blood cells anymore. So the red marrow produces all the blood cells for us. And the word poiesis means production, the suffix poiesis. And then you can break that down into erythropoiesis, red blood cell production, leukopoiesis, white blood cell production, thrombopoiesis, platelet production. So erythropoiesis is red cell production, leukopoiesis is white cell production, thrombopoiesis, because a thrombocyte's a platelet, thrombopoiesis is platelet production. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Under leukopoiesis, because there's lots of different types of white blood cells, you can have lymphopoiesis and neutrophoresis and things like this. So you can even break that down further. Protection might not be that apparent to you, but just think of your rib cage. You know, what's your rib cage doing? Well, it's protecting your heart and your lungs, the top part of your kidneys. You know, your entire kidney's not protected by the ribs, but the top part of your kidney is. So that might not be that apparent, but think of the rib cage and think of the skull. What's the skull protecting? Your brain. And then it'll be pretty obvious to you. And then lastly is leverage. And we're going to talk about a mechanical advantage. And your bones are really just a lever system. And the muscles are pulling on the bones. So we'll talk about the mechanical advantage or a mechanical disadvantage as the case may be, but it still has an advantage to it, as you'll see. So we'll talk about leverage and levers. All right. This is really lab stuff, but let's just go through it really quick. We have different types of bones. For example, we have sutural bones, and sutural bones are the bones, they're typically the flat bones of the skull, and these sutures right here, by the way, are where the bones fuse together. That's why these are called sutural bones. Books always say everyone has 206 bones, but that's not necessarily true, because you can see some of these sutural bones, like this one right here, is also known as a Wormian bone. That may, you may or may not have that Wormian bone. See, I may have it and you might not. So you might have 200 and I might have it, you may not. So I might have 207 bones and you may have 206. And there can be more than one of these Wormian bones up here. So, you know, when you say 206, that's approximate. We have irregular bones, and that just means their shape is irregular. So here's an irregular bone. Your vertebrae is a classic example of that. Not to compare and contrast, so not to be confused with, say, the carpal bones. And you had to learn all these carpal bones in lab last week. The carpal bones are really short bones. You know, this is the pisiform, and that's the hamate. And they're probably the weirdest ones of these 8 carpal bones, but they all are about the same shape. You know, whatever shape you want to call this, rectangular or rhomboidal, but they're all short. And that's what we call these, as short bones. Yes, the pisiform sticks off a little bit. That's true. That's absolutely true. And the hamate has a protrusion as well, and that's true, but they're still short bones. And they don't have enough projections to be classified as irregular bones, so we just call them short bones. We have the flat bones. Now these are the flat bones of the skull, not to be confused with the Wormian bones or sutural bones located within a suture. See, these sutural bones or Wormian bones have to be within a suture, and these are the sutures. Well, what are these called? They're flat bones. So I have the occipital bone here, and the parietal bone is showing you here, and you're going to learn this coming up in lab. So you have these flat bones. And by the way, the importance is this: as a child, all marrow is red marrow. All bone marrow is red. That means all bone marrow is producing blood cells. But as an adult, only the marrow of flat bones produces blood cells. The marrow of long bones, which is coming up here, is yellow. So adult flat bones have red marrow, and as an adult, long bones have yellow marrow. So these flat bones of the skull are pretty important, mainly because this medullary cavity has red marrow and it's still producing blood cells for us. Long bones are what they sound like. They're long, like your humerus and your femur. So these are long bones. And then we have sesamoid bones, or floating bones. Now you might think the kneecap is the patella. The kneecap or patella is the only floating bone in your body, but it's not. Some people have floating bones on their knuckles right here. Believe it or not, some people have knuckles, the metacarpal phalangeal joint. That's what I should call it for you. It's the metacarpal phalangeal joint. Some people have sesamoid bones on their knuckles. So what you're going to say to yourself is, I have kneecaps on my knuckles? Yeah, you might. For lack of a better way of saying it currently. is you might have sesamoid bones on your metacarpal phalangeal joints. You might have kneecaps on your knuckles. Some of us do, some of us don't. In addition, down here on the foot, on the bottom of the foot, all of us, or really most of us, have a sesamoid bone between on the hallux. Remember, the pollex is the thumb and the hallux is the big toe. So a lot of us have this sesamoid bone on our hallux. So there's more than just the patella when it comes to sesamoid bones. All right, now this is the bane of your existence right now, because there's your next 3 weeks will be learning bones and bone markings. So really learning the bones is not bad, but it's learning the markings that becomes problems. So see, you have processes, and you have to memorize the names of processes, like the coronoid process and the coracoid process. And yeah, they only differ in spelling by one letter. So yeah, that's a problem. Rami, rami means arm or branch, and you're going to learn some rami. You have holes in bones, and you're going to name these: mental foramen and supraorbital foramen and I'm not really seeing the infraorbital foramen. So you're going to have to learn these things. So you have a chamber called a sinus. You have a hole or a round passageway called a foramen. A deep cleft is called a fissure. A channel is called a meatus, like the external auditory meatus. That's your ear canal. So that's a meatus. And then you have canals, which is really a meatus. By the way, so what's the difference? Why don't I say external auditory canal? Some people do. But what the meatus really is if I have a long canal here, let's say this is your external auditory meatus. Could you say external auditory canal? A lot of people do, just so you know. But the meatus then, if you call this where you put the Q-tip to clean your ears, if you call this the external auditory canal, then what is the meatus? The opening of the canal. And sometimes openings are called os as well. OS. So you might see that word for an opening called OS or os. All right, so meatus and canal are similar. You have trochanters, which are large tubercles, for lack of a better word, but I haven't described tubercle yet, and it's just a rounded projection. So what's a large rounded projection? A trochanter. What's a small rounded projection? A tubercle. We have narrow, shallow fissures, if you will, or narrow grooves, and that's called a sulcus. See, let me go back. See how a fissure was a deep furrow? Well, a shallow furrow is a sulcus. A fossa is a shallow depression. You're going to have lots of fossas because joints. You're going to learn all the joints. And there's going to be like the glenohumeral joint. There's the glenoid fossa. And there's the head of the humerus. And they come together to make the glenohumeral joint. So you'll have crests, spines. I'm not going to sit there and read all these to you. You guys can read them. Tuberosities. These are roughened projections. A muscle usually attaches to them, like the deltoid tuberosity. So you can see that. A condyle is a smooth articular surface. All right. Sometimes the condyles are named, like the trochlea and capitulum. Now, what does trochlea mean? It means it looks like this. That you can see. Well, okay, let me draw it upside down. Looks like this. This looks like that. So you can see trochlea, and this word's used more than once in anatomy. It's shaped like a pulley system. And you can see that there. So the medial condyle of the humerus is really called the trochlea, whereas this one's the capitulum. And they're just smooth articular surfaces. All right, the structure of a long bone. The shaft right here is called the diaphysis. The end right here is called the epiphysis. I don't know why I'm spelling the word for you. It's right up here. And so how do I have two ends. I have this end and I have this end. What do? I have the proximal epiphysis and I have the distal epiphysis. There is a space in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis called the metaphysis. And we're going to talk about this metaphyseal area when we talk about bone growth. So we will talk about that. In long bones, the diaphysis is compact bone, whereas the two epiphyses are spongy bone. Now, I told you that the marrow of long bones turns into yellow marrow or lipids as you become an adult, and that's true. However, in the epiphyses of your long bones, even as an adult, you may retain some red marrow in your the marrow of your epiphyses. But the marrow, the medullary cavity of the diaphysis of your long bones is definitely converted to lipids at that point. Notice that another name for spongy bone is cancellous bone. And another word for compact bone is dense. Dense bone or compact bone. All right. That's a long bone for you. Epiphysis, metaphysis, diaphysis, and the medullary cavity being yellow in the diaphyseal marrow, and the medullary cavity being red marrow in the epiphyseal marrow. What a mouthful that is. This is the structure of a flat bone. You have a mix of compact bone here on the periphery, sandwiching spongy bone here in the center. Oh, let me go back and say something to you. Let me go back to the last picture. If you blow up this spongy bone, which we're going to do a little bit later, when we blow up these spongy bones here, you're going to see these spicules. And these spicules are called trabeculae. And the trabeculae. I must sound funny to you guys. So the spicules are called trabeculae. And then when you look at flat bone, it also has spicules. You can see these spicules right here, all these spicules, you know, here. You can see it. These aren't called trabeculae. They're called diploe. So what's the difference between diploe and trabeculae? Nothing, except for how they were made. So I guess I shouldn't say nothing except for how they were made. So nothing after they're made. They're the same thing. They're spicules of bone, but they are formed a little bit differently. The flat bones of your body are formed by intramembranous ossification, and actually I should correct that. Intramembranous. Not all the flat bones are formed by intramembranous ossification. Many of them are, though. So skull flat bones. Let me just skull flat bones. So skull bones and your facial bones, skull and face. Facial and skull flat bones. And then the rest of the bones, rest of them, are formed by endochondral ossification. So when I start looking at spongy bone from the flat bones or the long bones, a spicule is, the spicule is a spicule, but in one sense it's diploe, and in the other sense it's trabeculae, depending on how it formed. And that's the only difference there. And that's it. See you in the next section.